I don't think that we'll ever get rid of people with a true bloodlust for power, but I also don't think we'll ever get rid of the people who will stand up to them.
I'm Mitch.
And I'm Missy.
We're coworkers.
He's the boss, and we're married.
And she's the boss. Together, we host Good Faith Weekly, a podcast on faith and culture.
What could possibly go wrong?
Tune in and find out. Missy. Welcome to Good Faith Weekly. On this episode, Missy and I are going to catch up. We're going to do things a little bit different this week as we talk about the interview before we actually conduct the interview, because we've got two very special guests with us. Dr. Paul McAllister and author Ann Nelson are here to talk to us about an upcoming conference in Charlotte, North Carolina in January about faith and democracy. And then after our interview, Missy and I have a very sweet Christmas story that we want to share with you. In fact, it's a gift that from our family to yours that we hope you enjoy. It's going to be a great pod. Merry Christmas, and we look forward to this episode. Hello there, Missy.
Hey, how are you?
I'm doing quite well. Second time I get to visit with you this week.
Right? I mean, I am at my quota. I'm about done, boss man.
I know. I mean, I'm only allowed so many words a week, and I think I've used my total.
That's very true. Before 10 a.m., there is a word quota.
There is.
There is in our house. So, Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas to you.
This is our final episode before Christmas and our final episode of the year.
I know. Hard to believe. You've made it an entire year.
I've made an entire calendar year plus some.
That's exactly right.
It's been touch and go, not going to lie.
I can't tell you how many times she's quit after the episode.
There have been some moments, you guys. Yep, there have been some moments. But anyways, I don't know about you, but when I think of Christmas, I think of Christian nationalism.
Do you now? Wow.
In the absence,
what a segue.
In the absence of any sort of segue, there it is.
There it is.
So, I mean, Christmas, Christian nationalism, it's alliterative. We all know I love alliteration. So here we go.
I mean, we are nothing but a resource for people. And so we know that people are going to be going to their families for Christmas and sitting down for lovely Christmas dinners. We just wanted to give the folks something to talk about.
That's right. That's right. Listen to this episode on your way to grandma's. Get all fired up inside and ready for discussions around the Christmas tree.
Exactly.
That's right. So this week we sat down with Ann Nelson and
Paul McAllister
and talked about a conference they have upcoming to talk about faith and democracy.
Yeah, we've been invited to be a participant in this conference in January, and you're going to hear all about it during the interview. But it's about faith and democracy and kind of the intersectionality between those two and the importance of why people of faith need to stand up and fight for democracy, because I don't know if you've watched the news lately, Missy. Democracy's in trouble.
I don't know what you're talking about. So we thought we'd kind of give a little bit of an introduction into the interview in the beginning, because in the outro where we normally kind of discuss the interview, we want to keep it Christmas themed and offer a little gift from us for those of you who used to be Frasier watchers. It is not the story of the little goat herd, but we do have a little Christmas story to send you off with. So we wanted to just talk a little bit about the interview on the lead-in and why this is still such an important topic to be discussing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, just this week, the former president, who's the leading candidate for the Republican Party, used language that was very, very controversial, sent shivers down a lot of people's spine when he talked about immigrants tainting the blood of America. Very reminiscent of Nazi Germany and the same language that Hitler used. And so under the guise of Christian nationalism and that this is a Christian country and it needs to be purified, a lot of things going on that are very, very concerning. That was just what happened this week.
That was just this week.
Exactly.
Yes.
Obviously, there's been many, many more.
And the week's not over yet.
Examples, yeah.
So one thing that Ann talks about in the interview that I hope our listeners will kind of, key into is about kind of what you just said, or times in history when the language of Christianity becomes politically useful. Mm-hmm. And I'm going to kind of preempt, something she said, because I think it's worth stating twice. This is not verbatim, but she says, I don't think we'll ever get rid of people with a true bloodlust for power, but I also don't think we'll ever get rid of the people who will stand up to them, even at great cost in self-sacrifice.
Sure.
And I think that's such an important thing to note. And she, went on to talk about history having cycles where there's the appropriation and exploitation of the language of Christianity. And she talks about the fact that a lot of Christians have not found their voice yet because the Christians in the center have just been so taught to not be political, and kind of learning what that means and what that looks like to still stand up for what's right and be able to use your voice accordingly.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that has been lost kind of in our space and in the worlds and arenas that we walk in. We've done such a good job of advocating and amplifying the idea of separation in church and state. And while we respect that wall, we also recognize the importance of people of faith to stand close to that wall and to be a prophetic voice for those who govern the country and who lead this country. We think of Martin Luther King Jr., for example, and how beautifully he navigated that time and that era of being a prophet and speaking to people of power, but maintaining the importance of separation of church and state. And we've seen it in other examples as well. Because of that, we have grown timid in our engagement within the political process. And that's something that we're trying to convince people that they need to be part of the political process as people of faith. Because I believe that a majority of people out there are decent, kind, ethical people who want to do the right thing. Yes, there are a lot of complicated issues that we need to have healthy debate and conversations about. But in the end, we all need to agree that the only way for that to happen and to thrive is through the democratic process.
So I think that, circling back to what Ann said and what I said a moment ago, was that there will always be people who have a bloodthirst for power.
Yeah.
And I think we have to look at that honestly. Is this person who is speaking to me using, the Christian rhetoric and terminology and ideology to advance their own self? Or are they trying to use that for the betterment of the whole? And I think remembering what Jesus said, how he said it, how he invoked principles and teachings versus how a lot of our power-hungry political figures and just people are today is just really telling. And I think that's kind of a good measure. I
think it's a great measure, and to kind of feed into that importance of language in association with what you're talking about. I've got a perfect example of that, and it's simply the interpretation and application of the phrase kingdom of God. A majority of people, when they read that in the biblical text, have this image that is embedded in their mind that looks more like the kingdoms of Europe, maybe even King Arthur and Camelot. It's one of institution, it's one of power, it's one of
law and order.
Law and order, yes, absolutely. But what if we were to take it out of the European or Eurocentric idealism of the West and put it into a tribal context, maybe even the indigenous cultures of North America or the African tribes of sub-Saharan Africa, like the Ashantis. And that is a different type of kingdom. That is a communal agreement, a communal contract and social contract among the people to care for one another, to take care of the least of these, to make certain nobody goes without, because we are responsible for our brothers and sisters. It's not a power dynamic. Right. It is an empowerment dynamic.
Right.
And so just that little phrase, kingdom of God, has been perverted throughout the years to be more westernized or colonized than what it truly means. Because I know this is hard to believe, Missy, but but Jesus was not European. Jesus was not a colonist. Jesus was not an American. Jesus was a Palestinian Jew who lived in a tribal type of system. And so when he talks about kingdom of God, he's talking about community and our responsibility to take care of one another.
And I'll just add in one little thing to what you're saying, because I agree wholeheartedly, but not just taking care of our community, but taking care of creation in general.
Absolutely.
Is that we are responsible to and for creation and for our fellow man.
Absolutely. Well, we have a wonderful conversation with Ann and Paul about all of these matters. They tell you a little bit more about the conference coming up in January that you can still sign up for. So I think you're going to enjoy our conversation with Ann Nelson and Paul McAllister. So stay tuned. And then right after that interview,
we'll have a fun little Christmas memory.
I've always been struck by the scriptures we avoid reading, the stories we don't want to tell in church. I'm Brett Harris, and that's what You've Never Read This, a new series from God Knows Where, is all about. We'll read from prophets and histories we've hidden from ourselves, even words of wisdom and warning from Jesus that we've likely never heard. As with everything we do here, God knows where this will lead us, but I hope you'll join me. Find God Knows Where on your favorite podcast platform.
Welcome back to Good Faith Weekly. On this episode, we've got two very special guests with us. The Reverend Dr. Paul A. McAllister is chair of the Interfaith Caucus of the North Carolina Democratic Party and president and CEO of the Global Leaders in Unity and Involvement. Ann Nelson is an author and lecturer in international affairs, media, and human rights. Since 2003, Nelson has taught at Columbia School of International and Public Affairs. Her book, Shadow Network, Media, Money, and the Secret Hub of the Radical Right, remains one of the best resources documenting the trajectory of the religious right in this country. Both Paul and Ann will be in Charlotte, North Carolina next month on January the 11th, 2024 at the Faith and Democracy Conversation at Watershed Church. Along with other speakers, they will be answering the questions of how we got here and what's next. Paul and Ann, welcome to Good Faith Weekly.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
So first, I'd like to start by telling both of you, we want to wish you the happiest of holidays.
Absolutely.
And thank you so much for taking time out of a very, very busy week, very busy time, to have this conversation with us. So, Paul, I want to start with you and ask you to tell us a little bit about the need for the conference. Why is it important to come together to discuss the intersection of faith and democracy right now?
Well, the need is, I think, is pretty well established in the public domain. Many of us feel that our democracy is in crisis. It has been in crisis for longer than perhaps we have perceived. And so this is an opportunity to galvanize all of our energies and resources and momentum as we head into another crucial election in 2024. And we feel that the Interfaith Caucus of the North Carolina Democratic Party has an obligation not just to be partisan, but to be nonpartisan and to advocate for that which is most civil and that which engages us with others, even when we feel we may have certain levels of disagreement. So this conference or forum is an opportunity to model what it means to be interfaith and what it means to be multicultural and sensitive to others.
Paul, I'm so glad you brought that up because, one of the things that I'd like to follow up on is the fact that this is a caucus within the Democratic Party. And for so long, decades upon decades, we have seen the religious right in this country be very influential within the Republican Party. And there have been at times, it has appeared at least from certain perspectives that the Democratic Party hasn't necessarily been anti-faith, but has kept people of faith at arm's length. Do you see conferences like this opening the door for people of faith to have these types of conversations within the Democratic Party?
I believe it does, and I'm so glad that you've said that. There's a good friend of mine named Kerry Pay who reminds me through his Faith and Values organization in a small county in North Carolina that the Democratic Party, he believes, is the party of faith and values. And so I believe that this forum is an opportunity to close that gap in terms of perception and narrow the frame a little bit so we can look through history together. And of course, Anne has written a marvelous book that we're going to talk about, as well as others who will be presenting. And we hope that this is an opportunity for Democrats to see that faith is part of who we are as American citizens. And it really should have very little to do with politics or partisanship.
Ah, very good. So Anne, last time we had you on the show, we talked about your incredible book, Shadow Network. I still tout it as one of the very best resources out there. Your research on this topic was just incredible. And so I recommend it to everybody I can. And hopefully people are continuing to read it. So that was a couple of years ago, but now a lot of water has gone under the bridge since the book's come out and where we are today. And we could just list the items and events that have taken place over the last couple of years, beginning with the pandemic and the faith community's response to the pandemic, especially those on the religious right. We've got January 6th. I mean, the repealing of Roe v. Wade, just on and on and on, the influence the religious right has had in this country and its policies. So here's my question to you. Since the publication of Shadow Network, do you think people are starting to wake up to the realization that democracy is shaky at best and could fall at worst?
Well, Mitch, as I point out in the book, a lot of people's attitudes are shaped by the media they consume. Mm-hmm. And so I think that we now have two separate media systems in this country, one of which tries to be fact-based and the other which has a very naked political purpose and does not have allegiance to the facts. So if you live inside this media bubble that says that Trump is right, the election was stolen, and Anthony Fauci is, all of these misrepresentations, your attitude towards democracy is going to be different than if you go with the fact-based media. And for me, the biggest challenge of our time, and I feel that this is something that Paul is also addressing, and you as well with Good Faith Media, is how to bridge that gap. Mm-hmm. How people who have an allegiance to the facts and are thinking about things realistically can have a respectful but useful conversation with the other people on the divide.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that your book inspired me to do was read other books that you have written, which are wonderfully researched and beautifully written. And they're really, really compelling stories, primarily the stories that you tell coming out of World War II in the backdrop of the Holocaust. And so, and there's been a lot of concern about the rhetoric that we have been hearing, particularly from the front runner of the Republican Party, even this last week, talking about the poisoning of America's blood. In your research on your other books regarding the Holocaust, do you see any types of similarities today between the rise of Nazi Germany and the attempts made today to devalue democracy and in its place put an authoritarian, totalitarian type of government in its place?
Absolutely. For me, the big surprise in researching my book about Nazi Germany was looking at the period of the early 1930s. And you had both the extreme right with the Nazis and the extreme left deciding that it would serve their purpose to undermine the government, which was center left. And so they worked together and discredited the government. There was violence. And so when you have this powerful machine that's undermining people's faith in democratic institutions and weaken them, then everybody suffers from the consequences. Mm-hmm. So what I see and what I write about in my book is this assault on many of our democratic institutions. And I don't just mean election workers, which is the case, or January 6th, which is the case. I'm also looking at the assaults on local school boards through groups like Moms for Liberty, which is coordinated through this network I wrote about, looking at assaults on universities and university professors, and the whole way that we create a sense of knowledge and facts. So if people don't believe that facts exist, they're going to be much more subject to manipulation. And if you looked at my book, Red Orchestra, which just has a new edition, there was a group of Germans, and many of them were Christians, both Protestants and Catholics, who drew the line and said, we cannot go along with this. And one of the things they did was work in the media space and just try to put out publications for other Germans, orienting them as to what was really going on.
Right.
So I really feel that information is important, but also information that reaches the people it needs to reach. Like I live in New York City now. I'm from Oklahoma, like you. And what you have in our national media is kind of layering more and more media sources on top of people who are already well served.
Right.
And what we need is more fact-based media that reaches the states where the newspapers are dying off and the radio stations don't report news anymore, and where Fox News is misleading people. Mm-hmm. So that is another similarity, that the media systems are crucial, as is education.
You're so right.
So, Paul, let's turn to you, and I'm going to ask you a little bit trepidatiously. If this radicalized and perverted version of Christian nationalism wins elections in 2024, let's talk about what might be the outcome and what policies will be rescinded, what policies will be instituted. What do you think?
Well, my first thought was, as you were asking the question, what do we do? And that is we try again. We don't relinquish our right to try to make America what America has the opportunity to be. But to your specific question, I think we have to look at what's happening within the judicial framework of our country. Many of the rulings that have rolled back civil rights, rolled back individual rights, rolled back the opportunities for people to have voice in the democratic process. And for example, one of the things that I'm really most concerned about is how the Supreme Court has basically said how gerrymandering is non-judicial or judicial. I'm very concerned about that type of interpretation, because we can blatantly see the aggressive tactics that are being used in many state legislatures all around the country to hinder individuals from exercising their citizenship right to vote. So that is one area I am particularly focused upon. It is not a policy, but it is certainly a matter of law that needs to be looked at and scrutinized in a very different manner than it has. And that's going to take a lot of popular support in order to put pressure upon the legal system to revisit that issue. There are other concerns that I have regarding unions and collective bargaining in right to work states, and how these workers are being frayed in terms of their ability to have a collective voice. That's also very problematic. And then the final thing that I think I would focus upon is education. The problem that we see in Florida, that is mirrored in so many states around the country, with just not wanting to understand history. How do we get to this place where we seem to have this void, this deep chasm that we can't get out of when we want to talk about what has actually made America what it is, the good, the bad, the ugly, and the great, and present that to our children and give them the opportunity to fashion the world in which they want to live in for their children and their children's children. So these are three areas with respect to the courts, labor unions, and education, and the right to teach more freely and openly that I would say have to be addressed in 2024 and beyond.
Paul, I'm so glad you brought that up, because I got a follow-up question to what you just said. And that is, it appears that, especially coming from the Supreme Court over the last several years, that there is an emphasis to return the country to an early period of time that emphasized states' rights and permitted states to basically govern themselves without any thought to, a federal laws or an overarching law that makes certain that all citizens have the same rights in Oklahoma as they would in New York. With this return to states' rights, it's opened the door, it seems, to let states do anything they want. We saw it this week in Texas as the Governor Abbott signed a law criminalizing immigration on a state level. And we see it here in Oklahoma with the executive orders, with the elimination of diversity and equity programs in the state. We see it with abortion laws in many of these states. Is there a deep concern that America is returning to almost a pre-Civil War mindset that it will further divide this country?
Well, I know that the answer that you're looking for is obviously yes, and I would concur. And, some would even make the argument, Mitch, that we're already there.
Yeah.
Which is the most disturbing thing for me and members of the Interfaith Caucus. And as an African American, and we have members of the Muslim community and different faith communities, we can clearly see that this states' rights agenda, which is a push towards more individualism, more empowerment for those who are entitled and privileged at the expense of those who are lesser empowered and lesser privileged, is not democracy at its best. It does not make for a more cohesive union. And really, it puts us on the brink, Mitch, of wondering if we're going to see another civil war. And it may not be a civil war with guns and bullets between the North and the South, but certainly what we saw on January the 6th, that type of insurrectionist behavior and malconduct might be mirrored on both the right and the left across faith communities in rural venues as well as in cities. And so we're talking about a broad kind of conflict that I don't know how we rescue ourselves from at the state level. And so we need measures at the federal level to help bind the country together. And we need elected officials and pastors and imams and rabbis and people of all faiths to recognize that we have a collective voice that we need to express at all levels of government in order to rescue us from the paradigm of states' rights.
Well said. All right. So, Ann, you've covered many defining stories globally and experienced even more so here in the United States. So I want to ask you this, because a lot of people, especially within the Christian faith and maybe even in the faith community at large, have often said that the trajectory of the religious right, or this idea of Christian nationalism as it has emerged onto the national scene over the last few years, is nothing but a trend. Do you see it as a trend or something that has always been? and will be something that we always have to counter when it rises up?
Well, there are some, including our fellow Oklahoman Sam Perry at Oklahoma University, who say that Christian nationalism has become more and more of a political movement, and the people who are most active in it are less and less likely to be actual churchgoers. And certainly when I look at the beliefs that they espouse, it has less and less to do with anything I can find in the New Testament. And I've looked pretty hard. So, when you talk about my historical research, you had authoritarian movements that exploited the language of Christianity going way back.
Sure.
So, for example, in Nazi Germany, the German military went into the killing fields of the Holocaust with belt buckles that said "Gott mit uns," God is with us, as they massacred Jewish men, women, and children. And Hitler had a very famous, commissioned a very famous painting of him wearing a crusader's cross on a horse, as though he were representing a Christian cause. And I think that the majority of respectable theologians would see him more as the Antichrist. But politically, it was very useful for him to appropriate the language of Christianity and then use certain instruments of power, including economic interest, to whip a lot of the Catholic and the Protestant church people into line, because it became their self-interest to support him. And that's why it's so interesting to study these minorities of Christians, Protestants, and Catholics who, against their own self-interest, opposed the regime. So I don't think that we'll ever get rid of people with a true bloodlust for power.
Sure.
I fear that it's just hardwired into human nature, but I also don't think we'll ever get rid of the people who will stand up to them, even at the cost of great self-sacrifice. And the way I see it is that history has these cycles, and we're in another one of them now, where this appropriation and exploitation of the language of Christianity is happening in a shameful manner. And yet a lot of Christians have not found their voice. They're bystanders, and they don't see where they're supposed to fit in, because the Christian center has always been told that you don't mix politics and Christianity. And then you see all these other people cheating. Mm-hmm. And they say, well, do I follow the rules or do I try to become effective? And I see that us as all at that juncture point right now.
Yeah.
Wow. That's a lot to think about. I think what you're saying about
It's depressing is what you're saying.
No, I'm just, what she's saying about, those of us, who've been in the center and been taught a certain way, like you don't mix the politics. But then when there's a concerted effort by people who are seeking power in any way that they can get it, and right now in our context and this day and many days, like she said, historically, carrying that Christian label or those effects, things worked.
Yeah.
And it's effective.
And in the same vein, she also inspired us that there are people historically have been there to stand up against these folks.
Right.
Well, I also said that we're at a moment of truth.
Yeah.
And I do believe that lots of people will go into the coming year feeling that it's a time of decision. Now, whether they take action or not is going to have a huge impact on our future. And that's one reason I'm so glad that Paul is doing this conference. And I hope that people across the country will follow suit. And, I think the important part here is not saying Christians need to vote for one party or another.
Right.
I do feel that Christians need to defend democracy, and the choice becomes more and more clear.
So, Paul, kind of piggybacking on what Ann has just said, about folks needing to make a decision in this time of what's the right thing to do. Give our listeners some marching orders. Give us some advice. What do you recommend? What can we do to help combat, Christian nationalism?
Very good question. first of all, we need to understand what it is and what it is not. And Ann has already referred to Samuel Perry in his book with Andrew Whitehead, Taking America Back for God. We understand that Christian nationalism is an emerging identity. It is something that has caused many persons to come together around this core belief that Christians should dominate all of society. If you subscribe to the dominionism philosophy of seven mountains, whereupon Christians should rule, then I think persons need to at least understand the fallacies of that argument, that in a multicultural society, in a postmodern society, in a global society, that level of thinking and understanding does not move and motivate people to respond to God. It actually causes them to have more questions about God and their role in society in relation to God and to each other. So I would say, first, we need to understand what it is that we're dealing with. Then we need to look at examples such as Dietrich Bonhoeffer. We've talked about Nazi Germany quite a bit, and his name was just ringing in my head. And as a Bonhoeffer Fellow at Hebrew College and the Miller Center for Interreligious Learning and Leadership, I think it's important that we elevate the right kind of examples. We don't need examples that speak one thing and do something altogether different. We used to call that anti-statesmanship. Now we call that the status quo. Well, we need to get rid of the status quo and resurrect what it means to be moral, what it means to be decent, what it means to be humble, and what it is to architect a new future based on the Constitution and the language of the Constitution that says all men and women are created equal. And so I believe that as we think about how to deal with the recklessness of Christian nationalism, as it is being espoused, as it is being promulgated, as it is being used as a weapon of division, to call us to a place of deeper conscience and deeper concern for the common good.
Well said, sir. So, Paul, I am so thankful that the Interfaith Caucus is putting this conversation together in January. Can you tell our listeners, first of all, it's not too late to register, I hope. And if it's not, where can they register? And, tell us, how can they get involved in this?
You can simply go to ncdp.org/faith-democracy. That is ncdp.org/faith-democracy. You can register as a student or as a non-student, and we're asking for a minimal fee, not much, $15 versus $5 for students. And even those who wish to be sponsors, such as Good Faith Media is a sponsor, will be happy to take your money and use it in the most efficient and effective way to honor our guest speakers. And let me say this, if I may, Mitch, we also have not only Ann, but Catherine Stewart, who is the author of The Power of Worshipers. I understand she submitted a different manuscript now on the New Right. We also have Nancy McLean, Ann's good friend and someone I met several years ago, who wrote the stellar book entitled Democracy in Chains, and then also Aubrey Hendricks, Ann's colleague at Columbia University, whose book is gaining rave reviews, entitled Christians Against Christianity. So wow. ncdp.org/faith-democracy, and you can get to hear some wonderful speakers and some panelists from the local area here in North Carolina.
Well, it's going to be a great event, and we cannot wait to come out and to experience the evening and be with you and Ann and all the other speakers and community there in North Carolina. Well, Paul and Ann, thank you so much for joining us at Good Faith Weekly this week. But before we let you go, we always ask our guest one last question, and so I'm going to turn it over to Missy to let her ask it.
All right. So in keeping with tradition, we will go in alphabetical order by first name. So, Anne, as you know, our tagline at Good Faith Media is "There's more to tell." So in light of your work and our conversation today, what is your more to tell?
Well, actually, what I took away from that marvelous meeting that Good Faith Media held, there were pastors at that meeting who told me that they felt politically homeless. And what I felt in that meeting was that there were these issues that have been in the air that deserve serious consideration and discussion about human sexuality, about women's health and other issues that are very much with us. But they've been elevated and misrepresented and used to divide us and distract us from a lot of the main events of our society as defined by Christianity. How do we deal with the poor? How do we help the poor, help the stranger? How do we feed and educate our children, including those who have the least? I mean, if you look at the New Testament, these are the main events. And if you have a political atmosphere that divides the church and divides the Christians and distracts them from the hard work of Christianity, then you're undermining Christianity as well as democracy. So for me, getting our discussion back on track on how to be good people is what is left to tell. And my guess is that it will be left to tell throughout history.
Lovely.
All right, Paul, how about you? What is your more to tell?
We need to do more to end the unnecessary conflicts, such as what we're seeing in Israel and Gaza. And without trying to get into the issue, because it is a sensitive issue, we should be weeping and lamenting rather than cheering for one side or the other. And I would hope that the faith community would find the courage to have these challenging conversations where we establish what it is that we all need most in order to respect each other and in order to end the brutality and the savagery of unceasing, unnecessary, hostile wars. And I believe that in some respect, and probably feels the same way, you feel the same way, how we get there, I think it takes all of us. And I'm looking forward to being part of that conversation also as we move forward into 2024.
The event is Faith and Democracy Conversation on January the 11th, 2024 at Watershed Church in Charlotte, North Carolina. You can find out more about it by clicking on the show notes. But I've got to say, thank you both for a wonderful conversation. And Missy and I wish you a very, very Merry Christmas and Happy Holiday.
You too.
Thank you.
And see you soon.
Yes, see you soon. We just had a great conversation with Paul McAllister and Ann Nelson. I always enjoy talking to Ann. She's a friend of the pod, friend of Good Faith Media. First time to get to know Paul, but just very delightful. Looking forward to the conference in January.
Yeah, it was so sweet of them to pop on with us in a very busy week.
Absolutely.
As we are leading into Christmas weekend.
We are almost there. We're days away.
We're almost there. So I thought we should end this episode with something very Christmas themed. And while looking back through photos and memories the other day, trying to figure out what we were going to talk about, I stumbled upon something I would really like to share with our listeners. I hope it is meaningful for you. But to preface the story in not a short way, because I'm not capable of doing that. Growing up, I did not attend Christmas Eve services. You didn't either, did you?
I didn't either.
Okay, I was going to say, we were good Baptist.
That's
And
right.
in the Baptist church, you didn't do anything if it resembled the Catholic church.
No,
And Christmas
not
Eve,
at all.
Christmas Eve services.
Advent, nothing.
Nothing.
Yeah.
No, I didn't know the Advent candles or anything until I was an adult. Anyway, so we didn't have, this was not something I grew up with. And then you and I married, and a few years into our marriage, you decided to start having Christmas Eve services at our
Tell the
church.
truth, why we started Christmas Eve services?
I don't know.
Because we didn't want to travel anywhere.
Oh. Yeah, that was kind of, yeah. Sorry, grandparents.
Well, besides the fact we were, totally convicted by this day.
That's right. But if Mitch had to quote unquote work, then everybody had to come
Exactly.
at Christmas. Okay. So you're not wrong about that. But I was a little unsure about, it's Christmas Eve.
Sure, yeah.
I didn't want to go to church.
Right.
But that quickly became my favorite service of the entire year.
Absolutely.
And the routine was always the same. It was always stress leading up to it. Somebody was crying.
And
Usually was me
It's
because
gonna
the kids wouldn't get dressed or whatever. We'd go to Christmas Eve service and then it was all better. And anyway, so I just came to really love that time. And, it's been funny this week that we've been kind of passing back and forth.
But I want to interject, but there's also something that happened at the end of the service that made it very special.
At the end of the service, our family, the Christmas Eve service, our family always lit the Christmas candle.
Mm-hmm.
And then we started the candlelit singing portion.
As the congregation sang Silent Night.
We would go down the
spreading
aisles.
of the
And,
light. Yeah.
yes, we let our very young child pass. And that was always fun when he was little, trying to make
yes.
sure he didn't set the building on fire. And I don't know, it just became a really sweet tradition. Sure. And in fact, your last service as a pastor happened on Christmas Eve.
Yes.
When our boys were grown and in college, or I guess one in high school, one in college.
Right.
And that last Christmas Eve service, we once again lit the candle and passed, the light. And it was it's so meaningful to me. In any case, this last week we've been passing back and forth videos of churches who, because what good Baptist and Bible and non-denominational churches did when they decided to adopt this tradition from the Catholics was we're going to do it and we're going to make it ridiculous.
Yeah.
Right?
Absolutely. Well, we took the whole premise of the Christmas pageant as well as the singing Christmas tree, and we decided just to interject steroids into it.
Right. Okay, but let's preface, this is a collective we. You
right,
and I,
church.
Our churches didn't do that.
Yeah, absolutely not.
We didn't have the budget for that. And also, I wasn't going to have camels in my church pooping in the aisles. Sorry. I would have vetoed that. But, so it has gotten a little ridiculous and out of hand. But at the same time, our Christmas Eve services were really sweet. Mm-hmm. And there was one particular year, the year was 2009.
It was a dark, cold winter.
That's right. We had a weird in Oklahoma. I mean, we sometimes get some snow and ice, but that's about it. We had on Christmas Eve a blizzard of epic proportions.
We did.
We had, winds, which are not, unusual for Oklahoma, but these were blizzard winds with snow. We had snow drifts in our backyard, 4 feet, high.
Easy.
We had 14 inches just of standing snow on the ground. It was crazy. So keep in mind, this was 2009. This was before churches were streaming anything,
right?
Really. And we were actually going to drive down to grandparents in Texas after church that night. First time in years we were going to do that. We were looking forward to it. So obviously church was going to be canceled. I mean, churches everywhere were canceled here. And we were not going to be able to drive to see family. Not only that, but another wrinkle was that Santa was delivering gifts to Texas, not to Oklahoma.
That is true. We had already gotten a hold of Santa, rerouted him to the right location.
And it was too
Dallas,
late to change that delivery location.
It was indeed.
Anyways, so I was really disappointed and just really sad about missing Christmas Eve service. And you came up with about midway through the day on Christmas Eve, you said, what if I'm going to go up to the church. I'm going to go up to the church and I'm going to take a video of, lighting the Christmas candle, and I'm going to post it, to social media and send it to our church so that our church can collectively, virtually experience the lighting of the Christmas candle. Again, 2009, way before this was being done, right?
Right.
So you took off to go to church in, 60-mile-an-hour winds, blowing snow to get this video. I did not think it was a good idea, but you were insistent, and you did. And you came back home and you spliced it together and overlaid this video, and you talked our younger son, Tanner, into reading the Christmas story as it would have been read on Christmas Eve, and put it all together and release that video. And him reading that Christmas story at 8 years old is still the sweetest memory I have of Christmas. I get teary every time I see it and every time I hear it. And I still get messages every year about this. It was the sweetest thing. And maybe it was one of those things where you had to be there in that moment, and how, stressful and how catastrophic that blizzard was. But to be able to collectively still have the Christmas candle lit virtually with our church and our friends, and still have that memory today, just shows me that even out of something that was, so awful, I now have this memory that I would not have. I have this, sealed digitally. Yeah. I can listen to it. And I think, if you want to go on sermonizing, we could say that about a lot of things. Out of tragedy or out of something bad that happens, of course we knew that we were safe. We had, a home, we had warmth and all those things, but it's still a little bit heartbreaking when you don't get to do those things you look forward to. And so I think through COVID and all the other things we've been through, it's a good reminder that out of darkness often comes light. And so with that, listeners, I hope that you will appreciate, we're going to share this reading of the Christmas story by our son, Tanner, in 2009.
Merry Christmas.
In that region, there were shepherds living in the fields, keeping watch over their flock by night. Then an angel of the Lord stood before them, and the glory of the Lord shone around them, and they were terrified. But the angel said to them, "Do not be afraid, for I am bringing you good news of great joy for all the people. Unto you is born this day in the city of David a Savior, who is the Christ the Lord. This will be a sign for you. You will find the child wrapped in bands of cloth lying in a manger." And suddenly there was a multitude of the heavenly host praising God and saying, "Glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace, goodwill towards men." When the angels had left them and gone into heaven, the shepherds said to one another, "Let us go now to Bethlehem and see this thing that has taken place, which the Lord has made known to us." So they went with haste and found Mary and Joseph and the child lying in the manger.